The police lights slice through the quiet darkness of a suburban Colorado street. Neighbors stand on their porches in pajamas, whispering. Something is very wrong. A pregnant woman and her 2 little girls are gone. Inside the house, the silence feels heavy, unnatural. Toys sit scattered on the living room floor. Blankets still on the couch. And outside, standing in front of cameras, their husband and father speaks. Chris Watts looks directly into the lens, his voice soft, controlled. If they're watching this. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, just come home. I want them back. For a man whose entire family has vanished, he seems strangely composed. Almost rehearsed. Across town, detectives are already beginning the first steps of what will become one of the most disturbing investigations in recent memory. Inside the Watts home, officers move carefully through each room. No broken windows. No signs of struggle. But something doesn't feel right. A detective pauses in the living room. Where's her phone? Another officer checks the couch. Purse is still here. A mother of 2, pregnant, doesn't just walk away without those. Outside, Chris continues speaking to reporters, shifting his weight, hands clasped tightly together. I just want them safe, he says quietly. But inside the house, investigators are beginning to notice small things. Tiny details. Details that don't add up. Then comes the moment that changes everything. A neighbor walks toward the officers. I think you need to see my security footage. Within minutes, detectives gather inside the neighbor's living room, staring at a glowing monitor. The camera faces the Watts driveway. Early morning. 5:27 a.m. A pickup truck slowly backs into the driveway. Chris leans forward slightly as the footage plays. On screen, a figure moves in and out of the garage, loading something into the truck. A detective glances sideways at him. Is that you, Chris? Chris clears his throat. Yeah. I was heading to work early. The room grows quiet. No one speaks. The video keeps playing. No one else ever leaves the house. Not Shanann. Not Bella. Not little Celeste. Just Chris. And suddenly, the question hanging in the air becomes impossible to ignore. What really happened inside that house, before dawn? The first thing investigators would later notice about Shanann Watts was how alive she seemed in every video. Scrolling through her social media felt like stepping into a carefully preserved memory. Birthday parties. Laughter in the kitchen. 2 little girls running through the house while their mother filmed everything with a bright, proud smile. Shanann had built a life that looked almost picture-perfect. Friends described her as energetic, driven, and fiercely devoted to her daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Those girls were her whole world, one friend would later say. The Watts family lived in a large suburban home in Frederick, Colorado. Quiet streets. Identical houses. The kind of neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Inside the home, Shanann often recorded small everyday moments. In one video, Bella laughs while her father playfully chases her through the living room. Daddy's gonna get you, Shanann says from behind the camera, giggling. Chris Watts appears calm. Soft-spoken. The quiet father in the background. To the outside world, they looked like a happy family. But beneath the cheerful posts and smiling photos, something had started to change. By early summer of 2018, friends noticed tension creeping into Shanann's voice during phone calls. Chris had grown distant. Quiet. Withdrawn. During a trip to North Carolina, Shanann confided in a friend late one night. I don't feel like he loves me anymore, she admitted quietly. The words lingered. Back home in Colorado, the financial pressure on the family was mounting. Credit cards were stretched thin. Bills were piling up. And inside the Watts house, the distance between husband and wife was growing wider by the day. Still, no one believed the cracks in their marriage could lead to something far darker. But behind closed doors, in the quiet hours before dawn, a storm was already forming. And soon, that seemingly perfect home would become the center of a nightmare no one saw coming. The quiet hum of streetlights was the only sound breaking the pre-dawn darkness in Frederick, Colorado. Around 1:48 a.m., Shanann Watts stepped out of the car her friend had driven her home from a business trip. She laughed softly at something her friend said, unaware that this night would be the last time anyone outside her family would see her alive. Inside the house, the lights were off. The familiar glow of her living room, where she had spent countless evenings with Bella and Celeste, seemed to hold its breath. Shanann waved goodbye and stepped through the front door. Her friend lingered on the driveway, glancing back one last time before driving away into the night. By morning, unease had begun to creep in. Shanann didn't show up for her scheduled doctor's appointment. Her friends called her repeatedly, texts went unanswered. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Shanann was always meticulous, always reachable. Around noon, a close friend decided she couldn't wait any longer. She drove through the quiet streets toward the Watts house, heart pounding, every second stretching like an eternity. The neighborhood appeared normal, almost mundane, but the tension inside her was suffocating. She arrived at the driveway and hesitated, staring at the house. Shanann's car sat in the garage. Everything looked untouched, normal. But the absence of movement, the eerie stillness inside, made her stomach churn. She knocked on the door. Again. Nothing. Finally, she called the police, her voice shaking. "I'm worried about my friend, no one's heard from her. I think something's wrong." Officers arrived quickly, the crunch of their shoes on gravel echoing through the quiet street. Chris Watts answered the door, calm but guarded. "Have you seen them?" a detective asked, glancing around the house. "No. I don't know where they are," Chris said quietly, shifting his weight, hands clenching slightly at his sides. Inside, detectives moved methodically through the house. Toys remained scattered on the living room floor. Baby blankets still lay folded on the couch. Personal items, Shanann's purse, her phone, were left where she had always placed them. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. A neighbor approached an officer hesitantly. I think you should see my security camera footage," he said. Moments later, the detectives huddled around a screen, watching the driveway. The timestamp read 5:27 a.m. There, on the grainy footage, Chris's pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. A figure moved in and out of the garage, loading items into the bed. "Is that him?" one detective whispered. Chris's voice was steady but strained. "Yes. I left early for work." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Nothing else, no Shanann, no Bella, no Celeste. And just like that, the quiet Colorado neighborhood became the epicenter of a growing nightmare. By the time the afternoon sun had climbed high, it was clear, this was no simple disappearance. The carefully ordered life inside the Watts home had shattered, and every minute that passed without answers only deepened the dread. Somewhere inside that house, or in the shadow of it, the truth waited, horrifying and impossible to ignore. The search for Shanann and her daughters had begun, but the first signs pointed to a reality that no one could yet comprehend. Nicole Atkinson pounded on the front door of the Watts home, her knuckles raw from repeated knocks. "Shanann? Bella? Celeste?" Her voice cracked as she called out, echoing through the quiet suburban street. There was no answer. The soft hum of morning traffic and chirping birds contrasted sharply with the unease settling in her chest. The garage door was closed, and Shanann's car sat inside as it always did. Nicole glanced through the windows, spotting familiar clutter, the children's toys, the folded blankets on the couch, Shanann's purse and phone lying untouched on the table. Everything looked normal, too normal. But Shanann and her daughters were nowhere to be found. Panicked, she dialed 911. I think something's wrong. My friend, her kids, they haven't been seen all morning. Please, come quickly. Minutes later, flashing lights illuminated the street. Officers stepped cautiously onto the driveway, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Chris Watts arrived soon after, calm but measured, and let them into the house. Have you seen them? An officer asked, scanning the living room. Chris nodded slowly. No. I woke up, and they weren't here. I don't know where they went. His voice was steady, but there was a subtle stiffness in his posture. His movements, precise and almost rehearsed, drew the attention of the officers. Inside, the house was quiet, eerily so. The children's toys lay where they were left the night before. Kitchen counters were tidy. Nothing appeared disturbed. On the surface, everything was ordinary. But investigators noticed the oddities, the too neat arrangement of pillows, the lack of any signs of struggle, and Chris's unnerving composure. Detectives began asking routine questions, but Chris's answers were clipped, almost formulaic. I went to work. I think they went to bed, maybe out for a walk, he offered, each explanation sounding rehearsed. One officer caught a subtle hesitation when Chris described Shanann's last movements, his eyes flicking toward the floor before returning to the officer's gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then a neighbor approached, hesitating at the curb. I think you should see my security footage, he said softly. The officers exchanged glances, curiosity and unease mixing in the air. Moments later, they huddled around the monitor, watching early morning grainy footage. The view revealed Chris's truck rolling into the driveway, boxes in the bed, movements deliberate. Whispers spread among the officers. Something wasn't right. The woman they were here to find, the mother of 2 little girls, was missing, and the calm man in front of them, her husband, suddenly became the center of every suspicion. Every second stretched heavy. Every unexplained detail, every rehearsed word pressed the investigators closer to a horrifying truth. This was no ordinary disappearance. The quiet suburban house had become a puzzle, and the first pieces pointed to someone inside. Nicole stood nearby, tears welling in her eyes. Please, someone tell me they're okay, she whispered. But inside, everyone knew the morning had taken a dark and irreversible turn. Detectives felt the tension tighten like a cord around the house. They didn't yet know the full horror, but one thing was clear, the discovery of Shanann and her daughters had set in motion a nightmare that would soon unravel completely. The glow from a laptop screen illuminated the small living room where detectives huddled, eyes fixed on the grainy footage. The neighbor's hand trembled slightly as he pointed to the screen. That's him, that's Chris, he said. On the monitor, Chris Watts's truck rolled slowly into the driveway before sunrise. Shadows stretched across the quiet street, the early morning light barely brushing the houses. Detectives leaned closer, watching the figure of Chris move in and out of the garage. Something in the way he handled the boxes and bags caught their attention. It wasn't the motion of someone heading to work, it was deliberate, almost methodical. One officer broke the silence. Why is he moving so much, before anyone else is awake? Another added, and why in the dead of night? Chris stood behind them, shifting his weight, folding his arms, his expression calm but brittle. I just got up early, had some things to do, he said quietly. But the officers noticed the tremor in his hands, the brief flicker of tension across his face. They asked him to step aside while they analyzed the footage further. Every frame seemed to deepen the unease. The timeline didn't match Chris's story. Detectives cross-referenced the footage with cell tower data, GPS locations, and traffic cameras. Each piece of evidence tightened the net. The investigation began tracing Chris to an oil site several miles outside town, a property he managed for his company. Surveillance at the site showed the truck arriving with Chris alone. No children. No Shanann. Just him unloading carefully packed items, moving with purpose and control. Officers whispered to one another, glancing at Chris, who now stood slightly apart, arms crossed, attempting a calm exterior. But the truth was beginning to press in. His story, his explanations, were unraveling in real time. One detective's voice cut low through the tense room. "If Shanann and the girls aren't here, where are they?" Chris's eyes flickered to the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, then paused. Every second stretched long and heavy. Outside, neighbors gathered, unaware of the horrors being pieced together inside the home. Investigators began contacting friends and family, creating a timeline. Calls from Shanann's phone went unanswered. Texts unread. Every lead funneled back to Chris. One officer noticed a subtle inconsistency in his story. "You said you left early for work, but your coworker says the site wasn't scheduled for you that morning," the detective said. Chris's jaw tightened. Minutes became hours. Every small lie unraveled under intense questioning. The investigators' patience and meticulous cross-checking revealed an ever-darkening truth: the family's disappearance was no accident. By late morning, Chris was under heavy scrutiny. Surveillance, neighbor footage, and witness statements all pointed to one horrifying conclusion: the man who appeared calm in front of cameras was hiding a terrible secret. Each piece of evidence weighed heavier than the last. The calm suburban father had become the center of a nightmare that investigators were only beginning to understand. His routine, his truck, the empty house, it all painted a chilling picture. Detectives pressed forward, determined to uncover what had truly happened, knowing that every unanswered question carried the weight of 3 innocent lives. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and nothing would ever be the same again. The small, sterile room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Chris Watts sat in a stiff chair, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, eyes fixed on a corner of the room. Across from him, the polygraph operator adjusted wires and sensors, the machine humming softly. Every beep and scratch of ink seemed to echo louder than it should. "You understand the procedure," the operator said, voice neutral. Chris nodded, jaw tight. His calm exterior gave nothing away, but the officers watching noticed the subtle tremor in his hands. The test began. Questions were asked. Where were you the morning your family disappeared? Did you know what happened to Shanann and the girls? Did you harm them? Minutes passed. The polygraph recorded changes in heart rate, respiration, and sweat. The officer glanced at the monitor. Then the words came quietly but sharply: "He failed." Detectives leaned in. "Chris, the test suggests deception," one said. Chris's eyes flicked to the floor. His voice barely above a whisper, he spoke, I didn't mean for it to happen like this." At first, he told a story designed to shock and shift blame. He claimed Shanann had killed Bella and Celeste during an argument, and that he had snapped, killing her in response. He recounted it in a monotone, almost rehearsed. Detectives exchanged glances. The timeline didn't fit. The evidence didn't match his account. Items moved in the house, the security footage, the early morning truck trip, it all contradicted his story. One officer's voice cut through the quiet. "Chris, this isn't adding up. Where were the girls? What really happened?" Chris swallowed hard. His eyes darted from one officer to another. Every pause seemed to stretch into eternity. The room's tension thickened like fog, pressing down on everyone inside. The detectives pushed further, asking about the oil site, the boxes in the truck, the morning routine that had seemed so ordinary before. Chris shifted in his chair, the calm mask beginning to crack. I took them there. I didn't know what else to do," he admitted, voice shaking now. But the details were sparse, inconsistent, fragmented. His story teetered on the edge of something far darker than anyone had imagined. Each question peeled back another layer. His claims, designed to absolve him, only drew investigators closer to the unthinkable truth. The pieces of evidence, the timelines, security footage, and behavior patterns, converged. Detectives felt the weight of realization settle over them. The calm suburban husband, the man who had spoken so carefully to the cameras, was at the center of a nightmare far more horrifying than anyone outside that room could comprehend. The polygraph failure, the fabricated story, and the mounting evidence all pointed in one direction. Something had gone terribly wrong, and it wasn't an accident. The twists in Chris's account had not freed him, they had led investigators straight to the dark and tragic truth. Outside, the morning sun continued to climb, oblivious to the unfolding horror inside. Every question answered seemed to uncover another layer of deception, and the investigation that began as a welfare check was now a race to confront the reality of 3 innocent lives lost. The interrogation room was heavy with tension, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every second feel like an hour. Chris Watts sat across from detectives, eyes darting, jaw tight. Each pause, each swallow, was amplified in the silence. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, but even the mundane odors couldn't cut through the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Detective, Chris, we know what happened. You need to tell us the truth." Chris's hands fidgeted on the table, fingers interlacing and unclasping. His eyes flicked toward the one-way mirror, then back at the detectives. The calm composure that had masked him in interviews, on camera, even to neighbors, had completely dissolved. "Chris, I can't. I didn't mean." Detectives leaned in, their voices steady but firm. "Start from the beginning. Where is Shanann? Where are the girls?" He swallowed hard, a tremor running through his body. It started at home. I killed Shanann. I didn't know what else to do. It just happened." His words were jagged, almost choking, and each one felt like a hammer striking the room. The detectives exchanged grim glances. Chris went on, his voice breaking. I put the girls in the truck. Took them to the oil site. I left them there. The air seemed to thicken. Outside, sunlight streamed across the suburban street, ordinary and innocent. Inside, the room had become the epicenter of a nightmare. Each word from Chris shattered the image of the perfect suburban family and replaced it with something far darker. Detectives carefully recorded every detail, every hesitating phrase. Chris's description of the oil site was precise, methodical, too methodical. The investigators followed his directions and, later, recovered the remains of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste at the site. Officers moved with quiet urgency, carrying the burden of confirming the unthinkable. The calm, suburban father, smiling in photos, playing with his children, waving at neighbors, was now revealed as the perpetrator of one of the most horrifying family murders in recent memory. Chris continued, voice shaking with a mix of fear and resignation. I never wanted this. I didn't know what to do. It just got out of control. His explanation offered no relief, only the chilling clarity that the nightmare had been preventable yet devastatingly real. Every officer in the room felt it, the weight of the truth pressing down like a storm cloud. The confession, stark and brutal, finally lifted the fog of uncertainty. There would be no more guessing, no more hope that the family might be found alive. Outside, the morning moved on as if unaware of the horror contained within the walls of the interrogation room. Inside, time had stopped. Every whispered word, every sob, every confession etched itself into memory. Chris Watts had confessed. The nightmare that began with a missing family had ended with a horrifying revelation of betrayal, violence, and loss. The suburban street remained quiet, the ordinary hum of life continuing, unaware that beneath the veneer of normalcy, the darkest of truths had just been revealed. The Watts family tragedy would not fade, it would haunt investigators, neighbors, and the nation for years to come, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest danger is hidden in plain sight. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. Chris Watts sat in the defendant's chair, hands clasped tightly in his lap, eyes downcast. Cameras clicked softly in the back, but the usual media frenzy seemed muted in the gravity of the moment. Every person in the room felt the weight of what was about to unfold. The prosecutor's voice carried steadily, outlining the harrowing events that had led to this day. Chris Watts stands charged with the murders of his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their daughters, Bella and Celeste. Each word landed like a hammer strike, reverberating through the courtroom. Chris shifted slightly, his face betraying no emotion, though a subtle tremor ran through his hands. Defense and prosecution had spent months in painstaking negotiations. The evidence, security footage, timelines, his own confession, was overwhelming. There was nowhere to hide. "Judge, Mr. Watts, have you reached a plea agreement with the state?" Chris's voice was low, measured, almost hollow. "Yes, Your Honor." The agreement spared him the death penalty but condemned him to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, stark and unforgiving. Every person present understood the finality. There would be no hope for redemption, no chance to undo the horror he had wrought. Family members of Shanann and the girls sat silently, faces etched with grief. Friends who had followed the case for months, waiting for justice, held their breath. The courtroom remained still as the sentence was pronounced, the weight of reality pressing on everyone present. "Judge, you are hereby sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole." A quiet murmur swept through the room, a mix of disbelief, sorrow, and grim closure. Chris Watts was led away, expression unreadable, the gravity of his crimes now formally acknowledged by the law. Outside the courtroom, the world carried on, unaware of the raw, personal horror that had just been officially sealed into the record. 3 innocent lives had been taken by someone entrusted to protect them. The community, the nation, and those closest to Shanann and her daughters would carry the scars of this tragedy forever. In the stillness that followed, the finality of justice settled over the scene. The nightmare that began in a quiet Colorado suburb had ended, but its shadow would linger, a haunting reminder of betrayal, loss, and the fragility of trust. The lives lost could never be restored, but at least now the man responsible would never harm another soul again. The gavel struck, echoing through the room, leaving a lasting silence that underscored the profound tragedy of the Watts family murders. Every life taken, every promise broken, and every secret revealed culminated here, in the stark reality of a courtroom that could offer justice, but could never bring back the family. The sun had begun to set over Frederick, Colorado, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But the ordinary suburban calm belied the grief and shock that had settled over the community. Friends and neighbors whispered in hushed tones, replaying the horrifying news. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were gone, and the man they trusted, Chris Watts, had been responsible. "Detective, it's hard to process something like this, a family completely destroyed from the inside." Neighbors recalled small details that had seemed insignificant at the time, a sudden tension in Chris's behavior, the quiet withdrawal, the faint sense that something was off. Now, in hindsight, each moment felt like a warning ignored, a signal unheeded until it was too late. The Watts family's home remained empty, a shell of normalcy shattered. Officers had cleared the scene, but the echoes of tragedy lingered. On social media, Shanann's past posts of family celebrations and smiling daughters now carried a haunting undertone. The comments poured in, grief-stricken strangers trying to comprehend a crime so intimate, so unimaginable. Chris Watts was transferred to prison, stripped of any facade of suburban respectability. His life of quiet deceit, carefully curated social media images, and public appearances was gone. Every visitor, every cellmate, would know the truth. The man who smiled in front of cameras had taken 3 innocent lives. Therapists and counselors were brought in to support friends, extended family, and neighbors who were struggling to process the horror. Children from nearby homes asked questions adults struggled to answer. The weight of betrayal, the loss of innocence, and the randomness of evil had permeated the community. Detective, the thing people don't realize is how these crimes ripple outward. It's not just the victims, it's everyone who knew them, everyone who thought they understood their world. Documentary crews and journalists documented the aftermath with care, aware that sensationalism could never match the emotional gravity. Every interview, Every voiceover emphasized one chilling truth: sometimes the danger lies not in strangers, but in the familiar. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were memorialized in ceremonies that combined grief with remembrance. Candles flickered in parks, photographs lined memorial walls, and stories of their laughter and love were shared, refusing to let the darkness erase the light of their lives. The neighborhood slowly returned to routine, but shadows remained. Playgrounds echoed with children's laughter, yet some parents couldn't help but watch, vigilant, wary of the world's hidden terrors. And the story of the Watts family, a nightmare born in a quiet Colorado suburb, remained etched in memory, a cautionary tale of deception, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. Even as time passed, the question lingered: how could someone capable of such warmth and ordinary charm also harbor the capacity for unimaginable violence? The Watts murders became a case study, not only in criminal psychology but in human fragility, a reminder that evil sometimes hides in plain sight, behind the smiling faces and the curated family photos that mask the darkness beneath. And as night fell over the quiet streets, the legacy of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste remained, a haunting, permanent echo of love lost, innocence destroyed, and a community forever changed.